Ayan. So, wala nang intro-intro to. So, this is not supposedly my first video, but since someone was asking to answer a certain activity, instead of directly answering it, I would like to help some students na nasa-stress na kasi daw nasa-stress na daw yung may-ari ng activity na to because of too many workloads. So, I wanted to help a little, not by answering the activity, but explaining how it will be answered. So, bago natin masagutan yung activity na binigay niya, I would like to clarify first our understanding about assets, liabilities, and equity or the capital. So basically, in some discussions, I don't know in other books kasi, but basically there are three major account classifications that we usually encounter, and those are, yun nga, as I mentioned, assets, the liabilities, and the equity. So commonly or most of the time under equity, we will also encounter transactions that involved revenue or income and expenses. There. So let's start with the asset. So I'm gonna define it based on how I think senior high school students or even those junior high school students having bookkeeping in as their TLE would understand. So when you say assets, again, let's not go to bookish definitions. So these are resources that either an individual or a business entity acquires or owns, considering that the following factors uh, that you can read from books, but then again, ayoko siya i-define bookishly. So it arises, of course, from previous transactions, and since we're doing accounting, it should be measurable. Um, Measurable in terms of money, and there should be a future there's there is a future economic benefit arising from these assets or items that we call assets or these resources. So yun yung assets. So later, let's discuss about examples once we start answering the activity. So next are the liabilities. So if the assets are resources, liabilities are basically obligations. Okay? That an individual or a business entity how do we call this? Obtain or acquires. Pwede rin acquire. We acquire obligations sometimes. Okay. There. So, same with our assets, there are factors that we need to consider. So, these obligations should arise from previous transactions. Oh, nakalimutan ko. Benefit. Sorry. So, for liabilities, it should arise again from previous transactions. And same, it should be measurable in terms of money. Siyempre, paano mo i-record if we can't measure it in terms of money? Kaya nga tayo nag-accounting because we're trying to identify here where do our cash flows or where our money or other resources goes. And the difference here is there is a future settlement of this obligation. There, of the obligation. So, whatever is the residual or yung natira after deducting liabilities from your assets is your equity. Or sometimes we call this, or other books call this as capital. There. So, the residual value of assets after deducting the liabilities. So, dito po pasok yung mga investments, investment made by the owner to the business, earnings, there. So, since we're talking about investments already, there are two accounts that affects a business equity. So, the first is the revenue or the income. So, these are the earnings of the business, and expenses in layman's terms. These are items used up or consumed by the business. So, not all items that a business buy is considered an expense. So, I want to emphasize here that when you say an expense, it should be items used up or consumed by the business. So, later on, you will understand why I describe expenses like this. So, there. So, given these definitions here, let's go back to the discussion that was sent to me over the Facebook Messenger. So I guess there is a previous discussion here. So let us discover na lang as we go through the remaining discussion that was sent. So based on the note here, assets are on the left side of the equation, opposite the liabilities and capital. So putol siya. So I guess what this is talking about is the fundamental accounting equation. So let's go to the fundamental accounting equation, which we all know as assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. So in math, pwede mo siyang ewan ko kung ano talagang tawag doon, i-regroup siguro. So we can also state this as assets minus liability is equal to equity. So, yun yung sinasabi natin sa equity kanina, that the equity or the capital is just the residual value of the assets after you deduct all of the liabilities. There. But basically, I want us to focus on this fundamental accounting equation here, which states that assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. So, highlight natin yan. Ayan. So, why increases and decreases in asset are recorded in opposite manner. Capital rules apply sa liabilities and capital accounts. Hindi ko makuha yung context kasi putol yung notes na sinend. But anyway, let us try to understand this one. So, when we talk about debiting and crediting an account, it does not mean that when kung ano man yon, it what means increase, when it records a debit, I guess, recorded as a debit means increase, or when recorded as a credit means decrease. So debit and credit in accounting does not mean debiting to increase, siguro yun yung sinasabi ng notes na to, and crediting to decrease. Debit and credit simply means the left and the right side of the recording. So, lagyan natin sa notes para makita natin. So, debit, recording on the left side. And credit means recording on the right side. Okay? So, let us focus on this one. So, For those who have a little background already of the accounting, especially those who are senior high school students, always keep in mind that debit does not mean increase and credit does not mean decrease, because it depends on what we call as the normal balance of an account. Okay? So we will discuss about normal balance later. So again, bear in mind, pag sinabing debit, we are just recording on the left side. At pag sinabing credit, we are just recording on the right side. May kita nyo to kapag um, nag-journal entry tayo or gumawa ng mga T accounts. So when you say normal balance of an account, this is the side where we record increases in a certain account. Okay. So for example, if you know the, what do you call that? The debit credit theory wrap, 'di ba? Merong part doon na an asset increases with the debit and an asset decreases with the credit. Ganun. So, balikan natin yung equation kanina, ika-copy paste ko siya, wherein assets is equal to liability plus equity. So, ang titignan natin dito is itong equal sign. So, tatanggalin ko yung highlight. At ang i-highlight ko this time is the equal sign para ma-emphasize natin yan. So, lagyan natin ng space is equal to liabilities plus equity. Ayan. So, ma-appreciate niyan later. Bakit kailangan nating paghiwalayin yung mga yan with a certain space. So, looking at the equal sign here, all items that are on the left side has a normal debit balance. So, kung makikita niyo naman sa equation, there's only one item on the left side and that is your asset. Okay? So, that means assets, in terms of normal balance, lahat ng asset accounts, since ang asset is nasa left side ng equation, are increased with a debit. Okay? And all items on the right side has a normal credit account. So that means that liabilities and equity increases with a credit. Okay? So, nasaan yung revenue and expenses? So, let's go back. So, your capital increases kapag kumikita ang business. Okay? So, pag may revenue or income, that means kumikita si business. Therefore, ang capital or the equity will increase. Since equity, as you see, is on the right side of the equation, and the revenue causes an increase in your equity or capital, that would mean that to increase revenue or income, you will credit. So, this item increases with a credit as well. Okay? So, as for the expenses, when a business is using up or consuming items, that will cause their capital or their equity to decrease. Since equity, again, as I said earlier, increases with a credit, so kung magdi-decrease siya, you have to record it the other way around. So that would mean expenses increases with a debit. Kasi nga, pag may expense, nababawasan si capital or si equity. So, to sum it up or to summarize this one, ilagay natin siya sa table para mas madaling intindihin. So, normal balances. Lagyan natin dito ng debit and credit. So, highlight natin to. Oh, mali. Anyway, so i-highlight natin to si normal balances. Okay. So, the normal balance of an asset is a debit. So, lagay natin siya under debit. Normal balance ni liability, credit. So, dito natin si liability. Liabilities. Maging consistent tayo. Gawin ng plural. So, next, si equity, credit din. And then, followed by the revenue or income. Credit din ang normal balance. And then, si expense, normal balance niya is debit. So, yan yung summary natin for the normal balances. So, balik tayo dun sa notes. Okay. So, there. Kung makikita nyo yun nandito sa notes, ayan na. So, ganito rin yung summary natin kanina. Asset and expenses, they increase with a debit. DR means debit record. So, for liabilities, capital or equity, and the revenue or income, it increases with a credit. And the other way around, if asset and expenses will decrease, iki-credit mo siya. While liabilities, capital, and revenue, pag nag-decrease, ide-debit siya. So, let us try to classify based on the definition that we have discussed earlier. Let us try answering this activity. So, classify the following accounts to asset, liabilities, capital, expenses, and revenue. First is the cash on hand. So, balik tayo dun sa definition. So, let's start with the asset and let's see if magko-comply siya doon sa requirements or qualifications para masabi natin that it is an asset. So, pag sinabing cash on hand, is it a resource that an individual or a business entity will acquire or will own? Pag nagkaroon ba ng cash on hand, does it mean that there is a previous transaction where it came from? Can we measure cash on hand in terms of money? Or, pag may cash on hand ba si individual or si business, magagamit mo ba to in the future? Or will there be a future economic benefit? So, I'll give you a few moments to think about it. Okay. So, if you got it right, okay, that's correct. Cash on hand is therefore an asset. So, dito natin lagay yung mga answer to that. So, cash on hand. Sige, lagyan na natin ng assets, liabilities, capital, or the equity, revenue, and expenses. So, ilagay natin si cash on hand under assets. Okay, next, number 2. Delivery expense. Okay. So, medyo may clue kayo doon. But take note that not all account title na may word na expense is an expense. So, i-analyze natin mabuti. Delivery expense. Kapag ba si business nagbayad ng delivery expense, ano siya? So, tingnan natin kung asset ba siya. So, yes, there magkakaroon ng delivery expense if there is a previous transaction. Yes, it can be measurable in terms of money, but is there a future economic benefit? Once na binayaran mo na yung delivery at na-deliver na yun, that's it. So I guess it doesn't meet the last criteria. How about liability? Expense na nga binayaran mo na yung delivery expense. So is it still an obligation that need to be settled in the future? So I think it's not. How about for equity? So is this an investment made by the owner to the business or may earnings ba? Siguro not. So I guess, yeah, if you're thinking it correctly, this is really an expense. Kasi nga, nag-consume si business ng service nung kung sino man ang nag-deliver. So therefore, delivery expense will fall under expenses. Delivery expense. Okay, next. Service income. Of course, pag nag-render ka ng service, babayaran ka or whether it's not yet paid, basta nag-render ka ng service, income mo na yun. Kasi whether bayaran agad or hindi, eventually babayaran din naman ng customer. So, ilalagay natin yan under revenue. Service income. Income. Next. Ako, maingay sa background. Next is the Maria Domingo drawing. Okay, so for those who doesn't know this account title yet, kapag may nakita kayong drawing account, that means si business owner, nagwi-withdraw siya ng investment niya from the business. So this is an owner and a business transaction or transaction between the business and the owner itself. So kapag mga ganong transactions, na involved yung investment ni owner dun sa business, capital lagi yan. Equity related transaction yan. So si Maria Domingo, capital, dito siya sa capital of course. Okay? There. So next, purchases. So, pag bumili ka ng items na ibebenta mo for the business, of course, balikan natin yung definition. There is a previous transaction that it came from. You can measure it in terms of money. At since bumili ka nga ng items para ibenta mo, that means that there is a future economic benefit for the purchases. So, ilalagay natin siya as asset. Okay, next. Next is interest expenses. Okay. So, kapag nangutang ka, mag-i-incur yan ng expenses, hindi mo naman mapapakinabangan yung interest sa babayaran mo. Doon napakinabangan mo yung pera na inutang mo. But still, the expenses, binayaran mo yan. Kasi nga, may inutang ka before. So, the fact that you were able to borrow money, na-consume mo na yung right na yon, babayaran mo yung interest for that. So, ilalagay natin siya under expenses. Interest expense. There. Next is light and communication. So, gumagamit ka ng service dito, yung mga pailaw ni Meralco, yung pa-internet ni PLDT na, or nung kung sino mang network. Pag nagamit mo, syempre, na-consume mo na yon, babayaran mo. So, these are still expenses. Light and communication. Pero there are times that in some books, these are called utilities expense. There. Next is the accounts receivable. So, if you're familiar what an accounts receivable is, example nito is, for example, nagbebenta ka ng uso ngayon, face mask, disposable face mask. So, yung binentahan mo, hindi pa nagbabayad. So, since hindi pa siya nagbabayad, that means meron kang mako-collect in the future. Okay? So, balikan natin. Meron kang mako-collect in the future. So, that means mapapakinabangan mo to in the future. There is a future economic benefit that you can measure in terms of money kung magkano yung halaga ng face mask na inutang niya sa'yo. And that previous transaction is a fact na nangutang siya sa'yo, si customer. So, that means accounts receivable should fall under assets. Highlight natin yung label. Accounts receivable. Ayan. So, next is accounts payable. Okay, so kabaliktaran siya ni accounts receivable. So if si accounts receivable may ma-receive kang payment in the future, si accounts payable, this arises from transactions na ikaw naman ang nangutang. So in the future, you need to settle this utang or this obligation. So kung babalikan natin ulit yung definitions, this description of accounts payable will fall under liabilities. Kasi nga, the previous transaction is yung nangutang ka. Measurable in terms of money, magkano ba inutang mo at kailangan mong bayaran. And, syempre, kailangan mong bayaran yan in the future or to settle that obligation in the future. So, accounts payable will now fall under liabilities. Accounts payable. There. So I hope with those explanations that I provided, since we have a complete list of examples here already, sagutan na natin yung iba. And on your own, think kung bakit dun ko siya ilalagay dun sa category na yon. So next is rent expense. So lalagay natin siya under expenses. Followed by the land. So, land, ilalagay ko siya under assets. So, tignan nyo na lang kung nag-comply siya doon sa definition ni assets or nung mga criteria na kailangan i-meet ni land. Next is the cash in bank, another asset. Next, we have the notes payable. So, liability. Notes payable. Next is the sales income from the term itself. There. Then the advertising expense din yan. Advertising. Next is the licenses and taxes expense din yan. And taxes. We have the office equipment. So ilalagay natin yan sa assets. And next is the office supplies, asset din yan. Notes receivable, that's another asset. Receivable. We have Maria Domingo Capital. Yung kanina pala drawing yon. So, capital, syempre pag nag-i-invest owner, there, dun siya papasok. So, ilagay din natin si Maria Domingo Capital dito. Next is the building. So, it's under asset ulit. And we have the inventory. Under assets, we have the merchandise. So, bakit kaya pinaghiwalay ito? Anyway, commission income. So, ilalagay natin yan dito sa revenue. Commission income. Sorry. And lastly, the salaries and wages under expenses. Salaries and wages. There. So, yun yung mga account classification niya. Ayan. So, yun. That's it for this part. So, we will discuss in the next video about the remaining parts of this module sent to me. So, again, these modules are not mine. This was just sent to me to answer. So, I hope that kahit papano nakatulong yung magulong paliwanag. So, kung meron kayong tanong, comment yan na lang below. Okay, so for more videos, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification